Picture this: an endless sea of golden sand, where the only sound is the rhythmic sway of camels laden with treasures, spices, and secrets. These weren't just journeys across the desert. They were the lifeblood of civilizations, the invisible threads that wove together empires long before the rise of Islam. Today, we're peeling back the layers of time to uncover the hidden logistics behind pre-Islamic caravan routes. Were these ancient pathways simply about pilgrimage, or were they something far more strategic? The answer might surprise you. Think about the sheer scale of it: caravans stretching for miles, navigating treacherous terrain, braving sandstorms and bandits, all to connect distant lands. But here's the twist: these routes weren't just about moving goods, they were about power. Every step taken by those traders and pilgrims was a calculated move in a grand game of influence, where control over a single oasis could mean the difference between wealth and ruin. Cities rose and fell based on who held the keys to these corridors, and the ripple effects of those decisions still echo today. So what made these routes so extraordinary? It wasn't just the gold or the spices, it was the ideas, the cultures, and the alliances that traveled alongside them. These caravans were the original social networks, spreading everything from religious beliefs to revolutionary technologies. And behind it all, a level of logistical genius that would impress even modern supply chain experts. From hidden water sources to carefully negotiated safe passage agreements, the mastery of these routes was nothing short of breathtaking. Stick with us as we unravel the mysteries of these ancient highways and discover how they shaped the world in ways you've never imagined. This isn't just history, it's the story of how ambition, strategy, and sheer human ingenuity carved paths through the sands of time. The deserts of Arabia may seem like an unforgiving wasteland to the untrained eye, but for ancient traders, they were a meticulously mapped chessboard where every dune and depression held strategic value. Water wasn't just a resource, it was a weapon. The locations of hidden springs and seasonal wells were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of caravan leaders like sacred knowledge. Control a single oasis, and you controlled the flow of wealth across entire regions. That's why cities like Petra didn't just happen by accident. The Nabateans chose their capital with surgical precision, positioning it at the crossroads of the incense trade where routes from Yemen, Egypt, and Mesopotamia converged. One wrong turn, one miscalculation about water supplies, and an entire caravan could vanish into the sands along with its fortunes. But here's what's truly fascinating: these routes weren't static. They shifted like the dunes themselves, adapting to politics, climate changes, and even the whims of powerful tribes. A drought might close a centuries-old path overnight, while a new alliance between nomadic groups could open shortcuts that reshaped trade networks for generations. The rise of the Nabatean kingdom itself is a masterclass in this fluid dance of geography and ambition. By monopolizing key watering holes and charging taxes for safe passage, they turned barren stretches of desert into a toll road for empires. Even the might of Rome eventually bowed to this reality, negotiating rather than conquering their way into the incense trade. And let's not forget the human ingenuity behind it all. These weren't just trails marked by footprints, they were logistical marvels. Forward scouts called kafilas traveled ahead to negotiate with local tribes and secure provisions. Camel breeds were carefully selected not just for endurance, but for their ability to detect distant water sources. Some caravans even employed specialized water finders, individuals who could read subtle changes in the landscape or bird flight patterns to locate hidden springs. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. These routes were the ancient world's equivalent of a global supply chain, managed with a sophistication that would make modern logistics companies envious. What's often overlooked, though, is how these paths shaped culture as much as commerce. Every oasis became a melting pot where languages, religions, and technologies mingled. A single caravan might carry Babylonian astronomy texts, Indian spices, and Greek architectural ideas, all exchanging hands under the shade of date palms. The desert wasn't just a corridor for goods, it was a crucible where civilizations collided and merged. That's the real legacy of these routes. They didn't just move silks and frankincense, they moved the very building blocks of history. Frankincense wasn't just a fragrance, it was currency. In ancient markets from Alexandria to Babylon, a single pound of this sacred resin could command the price of a skilled laborer's monthly wages. The Sabaeans of Yemen didn't just harvest frankincense, they mastered the art of artificial scarcity, carefully controlling the flow from their terraced groves to keep prices sky high. But the real power players weren't always the producers. Look closer, and you'll find a shadow economy of tribal intermediaries, nomadic protectors, and urban tax collectors, each taking their cut like cogs in a vast, unspoken machine. The incense trade wasn't merely about supply and demand, it was a geopolitical lever. When Rome craved these resins for temples and funerals, they didn't send merchants, they sent diplomats to negotiate with the Nabateans, who held the desert toll gates like gatekeepers of the gods. Gold followed similar invisible rules, while the mines of Nubia and the Sudan fed Egypt's insatiable appetite. The caravans carrying it moved under layers of protection so elaborate they'd put modern security firms to shame. Tribes like the Thamud didn't just provide safe passage, they sold insurance policies in the form of blood oaths, where an attack on one caravan meant vengeance against an entire clan. This wasn't trade, it was high-stakes diplomacy disguised as commerce. Even the legendary Queen of Sheba's visit to Solomon wasn't just a royal exchange of gifts, it was a renegotiation of trade terms, masked by the glitter of gold and the allure of legend. Spices, though, reveal the most cunning dimension of all. Pepper from Malabar or cinnamon from Sri Lanka didn't just travel, its shape shifted. By the time these goods reached Mediterranean ports, they'd passed through so many hands that their origins blurred, allowing middlemen to invent fantastical stories about harvesting spices from nests guarded by winged serpents. These myths weren't just entertainment, they were marketing genius justifying exorbitant markups. The real marvel, how cities like Gaza became wealthy not by producing spices, but by perfecting the art of repackaging shifting cargo from Arabian camels to Roman ships with bureaucratic precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker proud. Beneath the surface of these glittering transactions lay a darker calculus. Control a single choke point like the Hejaz Mountains, and you could strangle a rival kingdom's economy overnight. The rise of Mecca as a pilgrimage site wasn't accidental, it was a strategic pivot when overland routes grew dangerous, redirecting wealth through sanctuary cities where violence was forbidden. Even the famed Silk Road's southern branches owed their existence to these older, grittier networks, where a merchant's survival depended less on maps and more on memorizing which tribal leader's daughter had married into which oasis dynasty. This was trade as blood sport, where the real profits went to those who understood that incense wasn't just something you burned, it was smoke screen for empire building. The desert sands tell silent stories of wars waged without swords, where the real battles were fought not with armies but with ledgers and alliances. Take the Quarese of Mecca, who transformed camel caravans into instruments of statecraft. By controlling access to the Kaaba's pilgrimage routes, they didn't just accumulate wealth, they built a political engine. tribal leaders paid homage not to Mecca's military might, but to its ability to open or choke the lifelines of trade with a single decree. This was soft power in its purest form, the threat of economic isolation proving far more persuasive than any army. Yet the most fascinating conflicts often left no bloodstains. When the Kinder kingdom sought to dominate Central Arabia's routes in the 5th century, they didn't launch invasions, they married into power. Their rulers strategically wed daughters to tribal chiefs along critical waypoints, weaving a web of kinship that secured safe passage. A single dowry of prized Arabian horses could buy loyalty more effectively than a chest of gold. Meanwhile, the Ghassanids and Lakhmids client kingdoms of Byzantium and Persia played a subtler game. Their caravans moved under royal seals, carrying diplomats disguised as merchants to negotiate alliances in plain sight. The real cargo, not spices, but secrets and schematics for fortress-building techniques exchanged between empires. Even bandits played the system. The Thamud and other nomadic groups didn't merely raid caravans, they sold protection. A tribe might allow an attack on one trader to demonstrate the dangers of traveling unguarded, then charge exorbitant fees to escort subsequent groups safely through their territory. This mafia-like protection racket became so institutionalized that some routes developed standardized toll rates, with receipts carved on palm leaf contracts. The genius, it created perverse incentives for stability. Tribes policing their own territories reduced chaos, making the deserts paradoxically safer for commerce under this unwritten code. The ultimate power move came through sabotage by omission. When the Himyarites of Yemen fell out with northern tribes, they didn't blockade routes, they simply forgot to share updates about shifted sand dunes or dried-up wells. Caravans following outdated information would vanish, sending a chilling message to rivals without a single act of overt aggression. This shadow warfare reached its peak during the infamous Year of the Elephant, when Abraha's failed march on Mecca wasn't just about destroying the Kaaba, it was an attempt to reroute the entire incense trade through his domains in Yemen. The real miracle wasn't the divine intervention legends describe, but how Mecca's network of alliances held firm against an empire's economic siege. Behind every bale of silk or jar of myrrh lay layers of calculation modern corporations would recognize instantly. Kingdoms employed what we'd now call data analysts, scribes who tracked seasonal price fluctuations, tribal conflicts, and even weather patterns to time their caravans perfectly. The Nabateans maintained what amounted to ancient think tanks, where scholars studied hydrology to predict which oases would flourish or fail. Control of information became more valuable than control of armies, with caravan masters hoarding route knowledge like state secrets. When Rome finally breached Petra's defenses, they didn't find treasure vaults, they found meticulously guarded scrolls detailing every spring and shortcut from Yemen to Gaza. That was the true prize, the logistics maps that made desert empires possible. At first glance, the annual pilgrimage to the Kaaba might seem like a purely spiritual affair, thousands of travelers converging on Mecca, united by faith. But pull back the curtain and you'll see a spectacle of raw political theater. The sacred truce known as the Haram months didn't just pause violence, it created a 4-month window where rival tribes could negotiate, spy, and strike deals under the guise of piety. Imagine the scene, sworn enemies sharing meals in the shadow of the Kaaba, their weapons temporarily sheathed, while their agents discreetly sized up each other's trade networks and military strength. This wasn't just worship, it was the ancient equivalent of a high-stakes corporate retreat, where alliances were brokered over shared rituals rather than boardroom tables. The economic undercurrents ran even deeper. Pilgrimage seasons transformed Mecca into a bustling trade fair where prices fluctuated based on caravan arrivals. The Quarese didn't just facilitate these gatherings, they monetized them, taxing every transaction from a merchant spice sale to a pilgrim's sacrificial lamb. Cleverly, they timed major markets like as to coincide with religious events, ensuring spiritual seekers became captive consumers. Even the act of circling the Kaaba had logistical genius behind it. The ritual's circular motion allowed participants to discreetly assess each other's wealth and status without breaking stride. But the real power lay in information. Pilgrims carried news from distant lands like human telegraphs, making Mecca an intelligence hub. A trader from Yemen might whisper of Persian troop movements to a contact near the Zamzam well, while a Syrian merchant could barter not just goods, but secrets about Byzantine trade policies. The annual Hajj became so vital to regional politics that when Abraha's elephant army threatened to disrupt it in 570, tribes who'd fought for decades united to defend the economic lifeline their rivalries depended on. Religious symbolism and raw strategy were two sides of the same coin. Tribal leaders knew that controlling access to holy sites meant controlling the narrative. By declaring their territories part of sacred routes, they could levy protection fees under spiritual pretenses. The Lakhmids of Al-Hira went further, building replica Kaabas in their domains to divert pilgrim traffic and its profits toward their coffers. Meanwhile, poetry competitions held during pilgrimages weren't just cultural showcases. They were PR campaigns where tribes polished their reputations through verse, knowing a well-crafted line about generosity could attract more caravan partners than any battlefield victory. Perhaps the most lasting legacy was how these gatherings forged collective identity. The constant mingling of dialects, customs, and ideas at pilgrimage sites created a shared Arabian consciousness that later empires would tap into. When Islam emerged in the 7th century, it didn't invent the Hajj, it repurposed an ancient system already fine-tuned for mass coordination. The genius of early Muslim leaders wasn't creating unity, but recognizing how to harness the invisible networks generations of pilgrims had already woven. Those foot-worn paths to Mecca weren't just spiritual highways, they were the social infrastructure that made an empire possible. Water wasn't just a resource in the desert, it was a currency of survival, and those who mastered its secrets held life and death in their hands. Hidden springs were more valuable than gold, their locations memorized in songs and stories passed down through generations. Caravan leaders didn't rely on maps, they carried mental blueprints of the desert, where a single misremembered landmark could doom an entire expedition. The Nabateans, for instance, didn't just control Petra, they engineered an entire hydrological system, carving channels into cliffs to redirect rainwater into hidden cisterns. These weren't just storage tanks, they were strategic reserves doled out to allies and withheld from rivals with the precision of a chess master moving pawns. The camels themselves were feats of biological engineering. Arabian dromedaries weren't chosen at random. They were bred for specific traits: wide feet to navigate shifting sands, nostrils that could seal against storms, and an uncanny ability to detect water miles away. Some tribes even developed specialized breeds for specific legs of a journey. The Mari camels of Yemen, for example, could endure weeks without water, making them indispensable for the brutal stretch between Sheba and Gaza. But the real marvel was how caravan masters orchestrated these animals like a symphony. A single misstep in the order of march, placing heavy cargo camels too close to a water source, for instance, could trigger chaos, wasting precious resources. Behind every successful caravan stood an invisible army of specialists. Scouts known as kafilas moved ahead like shadows, bribing local tribes for safe passage or bribing rival scouts to misdirect competitors. Water finders, often women revered for their intuition, could spot the faintest signs of moisture, a certain type of grass, the flight pattern of birds, even the way sand settled in depressions. Then there were the negotiators, masters of dialect and tribal law, who could turn a potential ambush into a paid escort with nothing but words. Their contracts weren't written on parchment but sworn in blood oaths, where a broken promise meant generational feuds. The most closely guarded secrets weren't the routes themselves, but the timing. Caravans moved by lunar cycles, not just to avoid the scorching midday sun, but because moonlight reduced the risk of ambush. Seasonal winds dictated schedules too. The monsoon patterns that filled wells in July meant August departures from Yemen, while winter caravans from Petra timed their journeys to avoid flash floods in wadis. This wasn't guesswork, it was data science avant la lettre, with generations of observations encoded in poetry for easy memorization. Yet for all this precision, the system thrived on controlled leaks. A merchant might accidentally let slip a fake route to a rival, only for them to wander into a dead-end canyon. More cunning still were the decoy caravans, lightly loaded groups sent ahead to draw out bandits, leaving the real treasure train to pass unmolested. The desert's greatest illusion, making survival look effortless when every successful crossing was a masterclass in deception, diplomacy, and sheer human willpower. The Thamud didn't just stand at the gates of trade, they were the gates. Caravans approaching their territory faced a choice: pay their dues or vanish into the dunes. But this wasn't simple extortion. These tribes offered something priceless: predictability. In a world where sandstorms could erase trails and rival clans might seize goods on a whim, the Thamud's tolls bought more than safe passage. They purchased a system. Tribal leaders maintained networks of scouts who monitored shifting alliances and bandit movements, updating routes in real time like ancient traffic controllers. A merchant might grumble about the fees, but the alternative, navigating the desert without tribal seals of approval, was tantamount to suicide. The Lihyun took it further. Based in Dedan, they didn't just tax caravans, they dictated their composition. Too many incense-laden camels from Yemen, the Lihyun might suddenly discover a new bandit threat, forcing traders to lighten their loads, conveniently leaving surplus goods in Lihyun storehouses. Outsiders saw this as theft. The tribes called it equilibrium. By controlling flow, they prevented market gluts that could crash prices, ensuring long-term stability. Their real power lay in subtlety. When the Nabateans grew too dominant, the Lihyun didn't wage war, they quietly rerouted caravans through alternate oases, starving Petra of trade until its leaders renegotiated terms. Challenging this system meant facing consequences far beyond armed resistance. Tribes held monopolies on local knowledge, which plants were edible where flash floods might strike. Even the dialects needed to barter with next territory's guardians. A merchant foolish enough to bypass the Thamud might find himself accidentally directed to a dry well, or discover his usual watering hole suddenly occupied by a rival clan. The punishment wasn't always violence, it was isolation. Without tribal seals on his cargo, a trader's goods became untouchable, his reputation tainted by whispers of dishonesty. Yet the smartest outsiders didn't fight the system, they hacked it. The Minian merchants of Yemen, for instance, married their daughters into Thamud elite families, weaving kinship ties that exempted their caravans from certain tolls. Roman traders took a different tack, employing local poets to compose verses praising tribal leaders' flattery that often earned discounted rates. Even failure held lessons. When the Greek explorer Eudoxus attempted to bypass Arabian middlemen by sailing directly to India, his ships foundered not on reefs but on the tribe's economic stranglehold. Indian merchants, long accustomed to Arabian intermediaries, refused to deal with outsiders lacking the proper tribal credentials. the true brilliance of this system. Its flexibility, tribal authority wasn't fixed, it shifted with the seasons. A clan controlling summer routes might cede influence come winter when rains altered viable paths. Leaders understood that absolute control was a myth. The desert was too vast, too unpredictable. So they built fluid hierarchies where today's toll collector could be tomorrow's client, and vice versa. When the Lakhmids rose as Persian proxies, they didn't dismantle the old tribal networks. They layered themselves atop as ultimate arbiters, skimming profits while letting local rulers handle the gritty work of route maintenance. What looks like primitive protectionism was actually a precursor to modern trade regulations. Tribes enforced standardized weights and measures at their checkpoints, settling disputes between merchants with binding judgments. Their scouts' reports on market conditions functioned like early commodity forecasts, helping traders time their shipments. The blood money system, where tribes compensated merchants for losses under their watch, anticipated modern insurance. Far from being obstacles to commerce, these gatekeepers were its lubricant, reducing friction in a system where trust was scarcer than water, the ultimate testament to their sophistication. Even empires played by their rules. When Rome annexed Nabatea in 106, they didn't abolish the tribal tolls. They rebranded them as imperial taxes and kept the existing collectors on payroll. The desert had taught them a hard lesson. You could conquer an oasis, but you couldn't conquer the knowledge of how to survive between them. Centuries later, when Islam unified Arabia, it didn't erase these networks, it codified them, transforming tribal guardians into official, safe conduct guarantors under the new order. The sands might shift, but the rules of power remained written in the same invisible ink. Mecca's rise wasn't an accident of geography, it was a masterstroke of economic engineering. Nestled between Yemen's incense groves and Syria's markets, the city occupied a sweet spot where caravans could pause before the brutal stretch north. But location alone didn't guarantee success. The Quarese tribe's real genius lay in transforming a seasonal watering hole into a year-round commercial engine. They didn't just host fairs, they weaponized hospitality. By declaring Mecca a sacred sanctuary where violence was forbidden, they created a neutral ground where rivals could trade without fear, turning the city into Arabia's ultimate safe deposit box for goods and secrets. What set Mecca apart wasn't just what it sold, but how it sold. The Quarese operated on a system of tribal credit so sophisticated it functioned like an ancient stock exchange. Merchants from distant cities could deposit goods with Meccan intermediaries, receiving clay tokens as receipts redeemable months later when market conditions favored higher prices. This trust-based economy extended beyond mere transactions. A trader from Palmyra might leave his son with a Quarese family as collateral for a loan, weaving personal bonds that lasted generations. The city became a living ledger where reputation was currency and a handshake could bind fortunes. Yet beneath the glittering markets, darker machinations unfolded. The Quarese didn't just facilitate trade, they manipulated it. By controlling access to the Kaaba's pilgrimage traffic, they could subtly inflate prices for certain goods during holy months. Caravans arriving from Yemen might find their frankincense suddenly less pure unless stored in Quarese warehouses for quality inspections. More ruthlessly, they played regional powers against each other, offering Byzantine diplomats exclusive access to African ivory routes while secretly assuring Persian envoys their silk shipments would bypass Roman taxes. This delicate balancing act required more than business acumen. It demanded the precision of a geopolitical tightrope walker. The city's true power lay in its adaptability. When droughts choked traditional routes, Meccan cartographers rediscovered ancient desert paths guarded by Quarese allies. When competing hubs like Petra grew too dominant, they orchestrated rumors of bandit threats along rival corridors, diverting traffic back to their gates. Even climate became a tool. The Quarese maintained an oral almanac of wind patterns and rainfall cycles, timing their caravans to exploit seasonal gaps when competitors were stranded by sandstorms or flash floods. Mecca's ultimate ambition, though, transcended commerce. The annual Hajj pilgrimage wasn't just a spiritual gathering, it was a soft power coup. By centralizing Arabia's disparate pagan rituals under the Kaaba's shadow, the Quarese positioned themselves as cultural arbiters. Tribes who once worshipped local idols now traveled to Mecca, absorbing its customs and, crucially, its economic norms. The city wasn't just selling goods, it was selling influence, standardizing weights, measures, and even legal concepts across the peninsula. When later generations unified Arabia under Islam, they weren't building from scratch, they were scaling up a system the Quarese had spent centuries perfecting. The irony, Mecca's commercial empire contained the seeds of its own transformation. Those same caravans that carried spices and textiles also carried radical new ideas, including the whispers of monotheism from Jewish and Christian traders. The Quarese network, so adept at moving goods, became an unstoppable vector for religious revolution when repurposed by Muhammad's followers. The city that mastered the art of control ultimately lost control of the very system it created, proving that in the desert, even the mightiest powers are just one sandstorm away from reinvention. Caravan raids weren't acts of random violence. They were calculated chess moves in a high-stakes game where honor and economics collided. Picture a moonlit night in the desert, where the only sound is the muffled hoofbeats of raiders closing in on a lumbering caravan. To outsiders, this might look like simple banditry, but every stolen bale of silk or jar of myrrh carried layers of meaning. The infamous Fijar Wars, fought during the sacred months when violence was forbidden, weren't just about plunder. They were brutal press releases, a way for tribes like the Hawazin to announce their defiance against the Quarese's growing monopoly. Each ambush was a geopolitical tweet, broadcasting strength or exposing vulnerability across the dunes. Why risk provoking wealthier, better-armed trading partners? The desert operated on a code where reputation was as vital as water. A successful raid restored a tribe's standing, proving they couldn't be bullied into unfair tolls or trade terms. But there were rules to this dance. Certain caravans were off-limits, those carrying pilgrims or marked with the seals of powerful allies. Attack the wrong shipment, and you might find your own trade routes mysteriously drying up, your wells forgotten on updated route maps. The real masters of this system, like the Thamud, rarely raided themselves. They let smaller clans do the dirty work, then stepped in as mediators to negotiate the return of goods for a fee, of course. Retaliation followed an intricate playbook. Victims didn't just chase the raiders, they targeted their economic lifelines. After a particularly brazen attack on a Meccan caravan, the Quarese didn't send soldiers, they embargoed the offending tribes access to their markets. Within months, the raiders were begging to negotiate, their warehouses overflowing with unsellable goods. Other times, revenge took poetic forms. One Nabatean merchant, after losing a shipment to a rival clan, funded a competing caravan that deliberately flooded the market with identical goods, crashing prices and bankrupting his attackers. The most brilliant raids weren't even about theft, they were about sabotage. A well-placed rumor could divert entire caravans into dead-end canyons or phantom oases. Tribes would bribe scouts to mislabel water sources as brackish or cursed, forcing rivals onto longer, costlier routes. The Ghassanids perfected this art, using their Byzantine connections to spread false intelligence about Persian-backed raids, scaring traders onto paths they controlled. Yet for all its chaos, this system had a perverse stability. Raids redistributed wealth, preventing any single power from growing too dominant. They tested alliances when the Lakhmids failed to protect a Pomeran caravan. Their Persian patrons suddenly found Syrian merchants too busy to transport their goods. Even the threat of violence had value. Caravans willingly paid higher tolls to tribes known for tolerating fewer raids, creating economic incentives for security. The ultimate irony, many so-called bandits were former caravan guards, laid off when routes shifted. Their intimate knowledge of schedules and hiding spots made them devastatingly effective, a reminder that in the desert, today's protector could be tomorrow's predator. When Islam emerged, its early battles weren't just over faith. They were the culmination of these centuries-old games of raid and reprisal. The Prophet Muhammad himself led caravans before receiving revelation, giving him first-hand insight into how to dismantle and redirect this economy of controlled chaos. The desert didn't distinguish between commerce and conflict. It simply wove them into a single, shimmering mirage of power. Beneath the glittering silks and aromatic spices, caravans carried a darker cargo: human lives. Slavery wasn't just an ancillary trade. It was the invisible scaffolding holding up Arabia's commerce. Enslaved laborers from Africa to the Caucasus weren't merely servants, they were specialists. Ethiopian miners extracted gold in the Hejaz, Greek scribes managed accounts in Petra, and Persian engineers maintained the very wells that kept caravans alive. The price of a skilled slave could eclipse a merchant's annual profits, making them both commodities and capital. But the real shock, many caravan guards were enslaved soldiers themselves, bought for their combat prowess and promised freedom after a set number of journeys. A brutal early form of indentured service that blurred the line between protector and property. Mercenaries operated in a similarly gray zone. Tribes like the Banu Kalb didn't just rent their swords, they sold loyalty wholesale. A caravan master might hire them for a single trip, only to discover mid-journey that a rival had paid them double to lose their way in the desert. The smartest traders played this system, hiring competing mercenary groups to police each other, a practice that evolved into the first recorded use of escrow payments. Guards received half their pay upfront, the rest only if the cargo arrived intact. This wasn't trust, it was game theory in action, with betrayal priced into every contract. Espionage thrived in this environment. A spice merchant from Gaza might spend years building trust, only to vanish overnight with knowledge of a kingdom's grain reserves or troop movements. The Lakhmids of Al-Hira famously employed merchant spies who used camel brands as coded messages, a white mark on the left flank signaling safe routes, a black spot warning of ambushes ahead. Even pilgrimage routes doubled as intelligence networks. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian wanted to undermine Persian influence, he didn't send diplomats. He funded Christian monks to establish monasteries along trade routes, where their religious travels conveniently intersected with caravan paths. The true cost of this shadow economy, its normalization, raiding caravans for slaves became so routine that pre-Islamic poetry celebrated it as sport. A poet might boast of stealing 50 camels and their Abyssinian driver in a single night, turning human suffering into verse. Meanwhile, mercenary tribes developed entire dialects of battlefield euphemisms. Clouds on the horizon meant incoming enemies, while thirsty camels signaled bribes had been paid. This wasn't just corruption, it was a parallel language of power where every transaction carried unspoken stakes. Yet the system's greatest irony lay in its fragility. The same enslaved soldiers trusted to guard caravans sometimes led rebellions, seizing oases and holding them ransom. Mercenary bands played both sides until kingdoms like Himyar began enforcing loyalty oaths sealed with branded tattoos, marking traitors literally as well as figuratively. As for spies, their greatest weapon wasn't stealth but patience. A Ghassanid agent might spend a decade as a humble cloth trader, only to trigger a trade war by accidentally revealing counterfeit goods in a rival shipment. These underground networks didn't just sustain trade, they shaped empires. When the Sassanids crushed the Lakhmids in 602, they weren't just dismantling a rival kingdom. They were decapitating Persia's own intelligence apparatus, which had relied on Lakhmid spies for centuries. The lesson was clear. In the desert, the line between commerce and conquest wasn't drawn in sand. It was written in secrets, silver, and the silent complicity of those who knew too much. Languages didn't just travel with caravans, they evolved with them. Picture a Syrian trader haggling in Aramaic with a Yemeni spice merchant, both peppering their speech with Greek loanwords picked up from Alexandrian sailors. These desert highways became linguistic laboratories where dialects fused into trade pidgins, simplifying complex grammar into practical communication tools. The Nabateans didn't just adopt Aramaic for its prestige. They stripped it of difficult script elements, creating a streamlined written language perfect for recording contracts across cultures. But the real linguistic alchemy happened in the shadows. Tribal guides serving caravans developed coded phrases. A whispered, "The moon is bright tonight," might warn of bandits ahead, while "the camels are restless" could signal an impending sandstorm. This wasn't just translation, it was the birth of a secret diplomacy dialect that crossed tribal lines. Religions rode the caravan trails like stowaways, transforming en route. Zoroastrian fire temples sprouted along Persian-controlled routes not by accident, but as spiritual way stations where tired traders could pray, and where agents of the Sassanid Empire could discreetly gauge loyalty. Jewish merchants from Babylon carried not only silks but Torah scrolls, establishing diaspora communities in oases that later became waypoints for Islamic scholars. The genius of these faith networks, their adaptability. Christian missionaries traveling with incense caravans didn't just preach, they tailored their message, emphasizing themes of divine protection for travelers to resonate with their audience. A cross carved on a desert rock wasn't merely a symbol, it was a billboard advertising safe passage to fellow believers. Technologies moved with deliberate stealth. The secret of Damascus steel didn't leak from India. It was smuggled out in the form of trade samples, blades deliberately left behind in caravanserais for local blacksmiths to reverse engineer. Greek water clock mechanisms reached Mecca not as gifts, but as barter payments to settle gambling debts between caravan guards. Even seemingly mundane innovations like the North Arabian saddle, which revolutionized camel transport by distributing weight evenly, spread through calculated demonstration. A clever merchant might lend his superior saddle to a rival's caravan master just before a difficult mountain pass, ensuring word of the invention would spread through forced admiration. The political orchestration behind this exchange was anything but subtle. When the Lakhmids wanted to weaken Palmyra's grip on trade, they didn't attack, they flooded the route with lost manuscripts extolling Persian governance models, knowing local elites would adopt the ideas and alienate their Roman patrons. The Himyarites of Yemen went further, requiring all caravans entering their territory to include at least one scholar translator, creating an artificial pipeline of foreign knowledge. These weren't accidents of cultural collision, they were soft power campaigns waged with scrolls instead of swords. What emerged from this cauldron of exchange was something unprecedented, a shared intellectual currency across the desert. A physician in Petra might prescribe remedies combining Egyptian herbs, Mesopotamian charms, and Greek diagnostic methods. Architects in Gaza blended Roman columns with Sabaean latticework, creating hybrid styles that later influenced Moorish palaces in Spain. The caravans didn't just carry goods, they carried the DNA of civilizations, cross-pollinating ideas with every footstep in the sand. When the first Arabic libraries rose centuries later, their shelves held not just Arab scholarship, but the distilled wisdom of every culture those tireless camels had ever connected. The golden age of the caravan routes didn't fade overnight. It unraveled thread by thread, a victim of forces both beyond human control and squarely within it. Climate struck first. The same oases that had sustained travelers for centuries began vanishing as rainfall patterns shifted. Tree rings from ancient acacia trunks tell a grim story. Decades-long droughts turned reliable watering holes into dust bowls. Petra's ingenious water channels ran dry, forcing merchants to abandon routes that had been profitable for generations. But nature wasn't the only culprit. Wars between empires transformed trade corridors into battlefields. When Persia and Byzantium clashed in the 6th century, they didn't just fight over territory. They deliberately poisoned wells along caravan paths to starve each other's economies. The Ghassanids, Byzantine allies, burned entire way stations rather than let Persian-backed caravans resupply. Meanwhile, the Indian Ocean was rewriting the rules of commerce. Roman merchants had long grumbled about Arabian middlemen marking up spices by 1,000%. When Hippalus discovered monsoon wind patterns in the 1st century, it opened a direct sea route from Egypt to India. No desert tolls, no tribal negotiations. At first, the change seemed minor. Land routes still held advantages. Camels could carry fragile goods like glassware that ships' holds would shatter. But as maritime technology improved, the calculus shifted. A single sailing ship could transport as much as 500 camels, with no need to pay protection fees to a dozen different tribes along the way. Ports like Aden and Sohar grew fat while inland hubs withered. The real death knell, though, came from within. Tribal alliances that had maintained route security for centuries fractured under new pressures. Younger generations, seeing dwindling profits, abandoned caravan work for settled agriculture or joined mercenary armies. The Thamud's legendary scouts found no apprentices to inherit their knowledge, leaving critical paths unmonitored. Even the Quarese of Mecca struggled to adapt. Their carefully cultivated networks meant little when ships could bypass Arabia entirely. Some cities fought back. Palmyra briefly reinvented itself as a pirate state, raiding maritime trade to force goods back onto land routes. But it was a desperate move, and when Rome crushed the rebellion in 273, the message was clear. The future belonged to those who controlled the waves, not the sands. Could it have been different? Perhaps if the caravan cities had united to lower tolls, or if tribes had pooled resources to protect key oases as climate refugees flooded in. Instead, they doubled down on old rivalries, hastening their own obsolescence. By the time Islam unified the region in the 7th century, the great caravan networks were already ghosts, their legacy living on not in bustling markets, but in the cultural DNA of the societies they'd once connected. The desert still whispers their stories if you know where to listen. The shifting sands of time never truly erased the caravan routes, they merely buried them beneath layers of modern asphalt and geopolitics. Look closely at today's Middle East, and you'll spot the ghostly outlines of those ancient trails in the most unexpected places, the gleaming skyscrapers of Dubai and Riyadh. They're the spiritual descendants of Petra's rock-cut treasury, built on the same principle: control the crossroads and wealth will follow. The difference is scale. Where frankincense once trickled through desert wadis, oil now surges through pipelines, yet the power dynamics remain eerily familiar. Even the modern Hajj, with its millions of pilgrims funneled through Saudi Arabia's high-speed rail networks, follows logistical blueprints first sketched in the dust by Nabatean water engineers. Political borders tell another story. That jagged line separating Jordan from Saudi Arabia. It traces an old Thamudic patrol route where tribal territories hardened into nation-states. The UAE's 7 emirates mirror the constellation of oasis settlements that once negotiated caravan tolls collectively, and the endless disputes over water rights in the region. They're just the latest chapter in a 4,000-year struggle over who controls the desert's lifeblood. The real irony, many modern conflicts stem from colonial powers drawing maps with no understanding of these subterranean networks, slicing through ancient kinship ties like a sword through silk. Cultural DNA proves even more persistent. The Arab world's tradition of intricate trade negotiations where hours of tea drinking precede any business deal isn't just hospitality. It's the evolved ritual of caravan masters assessing trustworthiness before committing cargo. The region's famed poetic duels, they began as verbal sparring matches between rival traders at oasis markets, where a well-turned phrase could secure better terms than gold. Even the concept of wasta, the personal connections that Greece wields across the Middle East, originates from the caravan era's unbreakable rule. Deals weren't signed on paper, but sealed through networks of reciprocal obligation. Yet history's shadows also warn of recurring patterns. The Gulf's current over-reliance on oil wealth mirrors Yemen's ancient dependence on frankincense, a lesson in what happens when a single commodity dominates. The rise of megacities like Dubai echoes Petra's fate, where environmental pressures eventually outstripped even the most ingenious water management. And just as tribal alliances once made or broke empires, today's regional power struggles still pivot on behind-the-scenes kinship networks outsiders struggle to decipher. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in what was lost. Modern logistics apps can't replicate the Kafila scout's innate knowledge of shifting dunes any more than satellites can replace the waterfinder's intuition. The desert's old code, where a tribe's word bound them across generations, has frayed in an age of short-term contracts, but there are flickers of revival. Young entrepreneurs in Oman are resurrecting frankincense trails as eco-tourism routes, while Saudi Vision 2030 deliberately echoes the caravan city's model, positioning the kingdom as a global crossroads once more. The sands whisper a timeless truth. Those who master the art of connection, whether by camel or fiber optic cable, will always hold the keys to power. The real question isn't whether we've learned from this history, it's whether we're wise enough to recognize it repeating in real time. The pre-Islamic caravan routes weren't just dusty trails, they were the silent architects of history, weaving together empires with nothing but footprints and whispered deals. Think about that for a moment. Without these networks, the world as we know it might look entirely different. No spread of ideas between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. No fusion of cultures in the bustling markets of Petra. No foundation for the trade routes that would later evolve into the Silk Road. These caravans didn't just carry goods, they carried the future. But here's what's truly humbling. We're still walking in their footsteps. Today's global supply chains, with their container ships and overnight flights, are just high-speed versions of those ancient desert paths. The same strategic calculations apply. Control the choke points, and you control the flow of wealth. The Strait of Hormuz isn't so different from the Hejaz Mountains. Both are narrow passages where fortunes are made or lost. Even modern trade wars echo the old tribal rivalries, where tariffs replace tolls, and sanctions mimic the embargoes the Quarese once imposed on rival clans. Yet something vital has been lost along the way. Those caravan masters didn't just move cargo, they moved with the land, reading the desert like a living map. Their knowledge wasn't stored in algorithms but in songs and stories passed down through generations. A modern logistics expert might optimize a route with GPS, but could they taste the wind for an approaching sandstorm or negotiate safe passage with nothing but poetry and a handshake? There's a lesson here about what we gain with progress and what we leave behind. So the next time you see a truck barreling down the highway or a cargo ship silhouetted against the horizon, remember, you're witnessing the latest chapter in a story that began thousands of years ago when the first caravan set out across the sands, carrying not just spices and silver, but the seeds of the world we live in today. If you've enjoyed unraveling these hidden threads of history with us, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into the past, and let us know in the comments, what modern trade mystery should we explore next? Until then, keep looking beyond the surface. The most fascinating stories are often the ones hidden in plain